following his death, where the disciples, they're found in an upper room in Jerusalem, hiding, really. They're living in fear of the Jews. And then you roll forward maybe about 40 days or so, you get to the day of Pentecost. And where are the disciples now? And what are they like? Well, they're in the middle of a crowd, in the middle of Jerusalem, in the middle of the Jews, and they are boldly associating with Jesus, and they're boldly preaching in his name. And it's just this complete transformed scene. So, what do we make of it all?
Yeah, yeah, because if you don't accept the resurrection, you need an alternate, historically plausible explanation of that data, that this message went out from the city where Jesus Christ was crucified. These people previously ran from suffering. Now they embrace it. They're willing to die for this message. What changed in their thinking? Well, the resurrection is an adequate explanation of that they genuinely had encounters with the risen Jesus Christ. I've not heard another suggestion that would adequately explain what accounted for that transformation. And sometimes we can be guilty in a modern world of what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery. Kind of look back and think
Yeah.
these societies were primitive, people were unintelligent, they're really superstitious and just would believe anything. That's just not true. That's
Yeah.
just that's wrong.
Thomas is an example.
Yeah, Thomas and Paul, when we do a separate episode on Paul, Thomas was deeply skeptical.
Mhm.
Paul was like openly hostile to the belief in the resurrection. When he became a
Yeah.
Christian, he was on his way to imprison and put Christians to death. So what brought that about if it wasn't the resurrection? And the truth is this, that Christianity was born into like the least ideal conditions that you can think of. It was not a society that you were expected to be conducive
Mhm.
to the message that was preached, and yet somehow the Christian gospel, the message that we now find in the Bible, it transformed that ancient pagan brutal society through conversions, through
Yeah.
individuals being confronted with the life, death, and yes, resurrection of Jesus Christ. And there's a verse later on in the Acts where the disciples, they're accused of, through their preaching, turning the world upside down. And that's kind of what they did, because the gospel message changed and continues to change the world to this day. How did that happen? Well, the message turned the world upside down because it transformed the people
Mhm.
inside out. Whenever they understood the implications of the death and resurrection of Christ, the people were radically, utterly at the core of their beings. They were
Mhm.
completely changed and converted.
Yeah. There was a video recently by Babylon B at Easter time. I don't know if you saw it. But it was basically playing that scene out where people would say, "Well, this was just a lie. This was just made up by the disciples." Um, but it's like, here, guys, here's a good idea. Let's all say that Jesus rose from the dead, and then some other disciples say, "Well, okay, what's in it for us?" I was like, "Well, we're going to suffer and we're going to die," and everyone's like, "Yay, let's go for it!" And this one guy's going, "Wait a second, is that? Are you sure?" And the point is, when you read through the Acts, and of course, that's not the end of the story for the disciples, but even in the text of the Acts, these early disciples, they lose so much, or they suffer so much. So within the first 5-6 chapters of Acts, they're in prison, they're threatened by the religious leaders, they're in prison again, they're beaten. If you go up to chapter 12, James, one of the apostles, is killed. Peter is then taken, and he's the next on the list. So they're facing they faced and often suffered the ultimate cost for the message of the resurrection. So this is incredible movement from running to save their life to, as you were saying, embracing suffering. And I will read this wee verse. Uh, the second time that they after they're in prison, it talks about how that they went away rejoicing to have suffered shame for his name. And I think the core of that is they believed in the reality of risen Christ. They believed in resurrection as a thing. They believed that suffering was temporary and there's eternal glory beyond. And all these things are, I think, make sense only because of the fact that it's all true.
Yeah,
Christ rose from the dead.
yeah, absolutely. Wes Huff was on the Stephen Bartlett's Diary of a CEO podcast recently, and I think one of the things that he said, Stephen was kind of asking him about some of the things that we were discussing, and he said, if I remember it correctly, he said liars make bad martyrs because people will die for the truth. Occasionally they will die for lies that they believe to be the truth, but no one dies for a lie that they have made up themselves. And that response to suffering is one of the things. I mean, there's nothing more Christ-like than em- confronting, embracing, enduring suffering that leads to joy. But that's one of the things that really brought transformation as people heard the gospel. They didn't just hear sort of a list of commands to fulfill. They didn't hear an interesting story. They saw something that made a difference in people's lives. One of the examples of this is in Acts chapter 16. Paul and Silas are imprisoned for preaching the gospel in the city of Philippi. And there's a jailer, prison warden in that prison. It's likely that he's a former Roman soldier. He's a former Roman soldier. He has seen some stuff. He's probably
Yeah.
done some stuff. A lot of brutality. And Paul and Silas come to him. They've been viciously beaten. They've been unrighteously imprisoned. He throws them in the stocks. And at midnight, they're singing and praising God. So this man had seen suffering, but he hadn't seen a response to suffering like that. And that is one of the things. The evidence of the power in the message is not just, we've been talking about a lot of the factual basis for Christianity, and that's really important. Without evidence, there's no possibility of faith. But the power that's in the message is also seen in the transformation of the lives of the people who embrace that message, who believe it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We want to continue this theme of transformation.
Yeah.
We'll look at that in the next couple of episodes, just how the gospel transformed individuals, groups of people,
Yeah.